They say some caves hold secrets that were never meant to see daylight. In the cliffs of Ayrshire, Scotland, there's a darkness so complete, so consuming, that even the ocean itself tried to hide it twice a day. What happened in those depths defies everything we understand about human nature, about family, about survival. And the worst part, for 25 years, nobody knew it was happening. Nobody suspected. Nobody searched, until the day the screaming started at a country fair, and a trail of blood led 400 armed men into the mouth of hell itself. What they found hanging from those cave walls wasn't just murder. It wasn't just madness. It was something that redefined evil for generations to come. This is the story that inspired the Hills Have Eyes, that made Hannibal Lecter look like an amateur, that turned a Scottish legend into a nightmare whispered across centuries. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. What the chroniclers were too horrified to fully describe, what modern scholars desperately want to dismiss as propaganda. Because if this really happened, if even half of what was discovered in Bennane Cave that day was real, then we have to confront a terrifying truth about what humans are capable of becoming when they turn their backs on civilization and embrace the darkness completely. The story begins not with horror, but with disappointment. Alexander Behan, known as Sawney to those who knew him, was born in East Lothian in the dying years of the 15th century. During a time when Scotland was a land of bitter poverty and brutal survival, he was the son of a tanner, a man who worked with dead animal hides, scraping and curing leather in conditions that would make most people vomit. It was honest work, if you could call it that, but young Sawney wanted nothing to do with it. He watched his father's hands crack and bleed from the lime and tannins, watched him age before his time, watched him die poor despite a lifetime of labor, and Sawney made a decision that would echo through history. He would not follow that path. He would not break his back for pennies. He would not slave away in legitimate trades that barely kept a man fed. Instead, he found a woman who shared his contempt for ordinary life, a woman whose name has been lost to time but whose darkness matched his own. Some accounts call her Black Agnes Douglas, though that name might be borrowed from another dark figure in Scottish history. What we know is that together, they made a choice that would damn them both. They decided that the world owed them something, that they would take what they needed, and that anyone who stood in their way was simply meat waiting to be harvested. They left behind the world of daylight and walked into shadow, searching for a place where no one would ever find them, where they could build their kingdom of night. Bennane Cave stretched like a wound in the cliffs between Girvan and Ballantrae, a gaping mouth that the sea filled and emptied with every tide. Most locals avoided it, not just because of the treacherous waters that flooded its entrance twice daily, but because something about it felt wrong, felt hungry. The cave system penetrated more than a mile into solid rock, a labyrinth of passages and chambers where darkness was so complete that even torchlight seemed to be swallowed whole. It was perfect for what Sawney and his bride had in mind. The entrance was hidden at high tide, submerged under cold Scottish waters that would deter any casual explorers. The main passage twisted and turned, branching into side chambers that could serve 1,000 purposes. The walls wept with moisture, creating a constant drip that echoed through the darkness like a heartbeat. This would be their castle, their fortress, their hunting lodge. They moved in with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and a plan that was elegant in its simplicity and monstrous in its execution. Sawney would ambush travelers on the lonely coastal roads, the narrow paths that connected isolated villages where strangers were common and disappearances could be explained away. At first, it was just robbery, quick strikes in the twilight, taking purses and valuables before vanishing back into the rocks. But then came the problem that transforms criminals into monsters. Witnesses. Dead men tell no tales, as the saying goes, and Sawney took that wisdom to heart. Why leave victims alive to report to authorities, to describe his face, to organize men? Better to silence them permanently. Better to ensure that every robbery ended with a body that would never raise an alarm. But then came the second problem, and this is where legend bleeds into nightmare. What do you do with the bodies? You can't leave them on the road, can't risk them being found too quickly. You can't bury them in the rocky Scottish soil without proper tools and time you don't have. You can't burn them without smoke, giving away your location. So you drag them back to the cave, back to the darkness, back to the dripping walls and the chambers that stretch away from any human eyes. And there, and that lightless place where morality itself seemed to rot away. Sawney and his wife made a discovery that would define their legacy. Human flesh, when properly prepared, when salted and pickled and stored in the cool darkness of a sea cave, could feed you 4 weeks. Why waste money on food when your victims carried meat on their bones? Why let evidence go to waste when it could serve a practical purpose? This wasn't cannibalism born of desperation or starvation or shipwreck madness. This was calculated. This was efficient. This was a business decision made by 2 people who had crossed a line so fundamental that there was no coming back. They began to systematically butcher their victims, hanging limbs and torsos from the cave walls like a grotesque larder, pickling organs in barrels, treating human bodies with the same casual efficiency that Sawney's father had once treated animal hides. The irony wasn't lost on history. The son, who refused to be a tanner, became a butcher of a different kind, and then Mrs. Bean became pregnant. 14 times. 14 children raised in absolute darkness, fed on human flesh from birth, knowing no other life, no outer food, no other normal. 14 children who would never see the inside of a church, or a school, or a normal home. 14 children who would grow up thinking that murder and cannibalism were simply how families survived. Imagine being born in absolute darkness. Never seeing the sun except as a distant glow at the cave entrance when the tide was out. Never tasting bread or cheese or ale. Never hearing a kind word or a gentle song. The Bean children grew up in a world where screaming was background noise, where the smell of death was ordinary, where family dinner meant gathering around dismembered bodies and deciding which parts to eat first. They learned to walk in pitch darkness, navigating the mule-long passages by touch and sound. They learned to fight like animals, because that's what they were becoming. They learned to hunt in packs, to ambush travelers with military precision, to drag struggling victims back to the cave while their parents watched with pride. And because there was no one else, because their entire world consisted of the cave and the family and the hunt, the Bean children began to produce Bean grandchildren through incest. Brothers with sisters. Cousins with cousins. A family tree that folded in on itself, like a knot producing 32 more. Mouths to feed 32 more. Cannibals raised in darkness, 32 more proof. Points that humanity itself could be bred out of humans if you started early enough. By now, the family numbered 48. 48 people, living in secret beneath the Scottish countryside, sustained entirely by robbery and murder and cannibalism. Think about the logistics of that for a moment. To feed 48 people on human flesh alone, you need constant victims, multiple people every week. Hundreds per year. The accounts claim they killed and consumed over 1,000 people during their 25-year reign. That's 40 people per year, every year, for a quarter century. That's a small village worth of human beings who simply vanished on lonely Scottish roads, never to be seen again except as pickled meat hanging in darkness. Meanwhile, on the surface, in the world of daylight and law and normalcy, confusion was turning to panic. People were disappearing. Not occasionally, not rarely, constantly. Travelers who set out on the coastal roads simply never arrived at their destinations. Merchants vanished. Farmers disappeared. Women and children went missing. At first, the local authorities assumed bandits, or wild animals, or accidents. But the numbers kept climbing. The missing persons list grew longer and longer until it became something unprecedented in Scottish history, a record of loss so extensive that it demanded explanation. Search parties were organized. The countryside was combed. Innocent innkeepers were arrested on suspicion of murder. Some were even executed, victims of a panicked justice system that needed someone to blame. But the disappearances continued. Then the bodies started washing up on the beaches, or rather, parts of bodies. A pickled limb would roll in with the tide, preserved in brine. Clearly human, clearly butchered. An arm here, a leg there, a torso so preserved in salt that it looked almost mummified. These weren't drowning victims or shipwreck casualties. These were remains that had been carefully processed, stored, and then apparently thrown away like scraps, and they were no longer fresh enough to eat. The implications were horrifying. Someone was killing people in massive numbers. Someone was preserving the bodies. Someone was doing this with industrial efficiency. But where? Every cave had been searched, or so they thought. Every abandoned building had been investigated. How could 48 people live completely undetected for decades while conducting a murder and cannibalism operation on this scale? The answer was hiding in plain sight, behind walls of seawater that flooded Bennane Cave's entrance twice a day, making it seem like just another shallow coastal hollow instead of the mile-deep labyrinth that it truly was. The beginning of the end came on an ordinary evening at a country fair. The kind of gathering where farmers and their wives would trade goods, where children would run between stalls, where the ale flowed freely and neighbors became friends. A man and his wife were riding home on horseback, their saddlebags heavy with purchases, following a coastal road that thousands had traveled before them. They were happy. They were unsuspecting. They were the wrong people in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Bean clan attacked with practiced precision, a coordinated assault that had been refined through hundreds of previous murders. Multiple family members swarmed from the rocks and heather, pulling the wife from her horse with terrifying efficiency. What happened next destroyed whatever humanity the man thought existed in the world. They didn't drag her away. They didn't wait. Right there on the road, in front of her husband, they stripped her and began to disembowel her while she screamed. They were so confident, so practiced, so used to isolated victims who could unfight back that they didn't notice the first group was attacking too soon. The husband, watching his wife being literally torn apart, found strength that only extreme horror can provide. He fought like a demon, driving his horse into the attackers, trampling some, scattering others. His sword flashed in the dimming light. He was outnumbered, but terror gave him power. And then salvation arrived in the form of other fairgoers. 20 people traveling together on the same road, drawn by the screams. The Bean clan suddenly found themselves facing organized resistance for the first time in 25 years. They weren't prepared for it. Their advantage had always been surprise, isolation, overwhelming numbers against individuals or small groups. But here were 20 fresh fighters, armed with fair-day weapons, angry and sober enough to fight effectively. The Beans retreated. For the first time ever, Tay Whitray, leaving behind the mutilated body of the woman, a score of witnesses, and one survivor who could tell the tale. That survivor was taken before the Chief Magistrate of Glasgow, a man who had been tracking the disappearances for years without any leads, without any suspects, without any explanation that made sense. Now, finally, he had an eyewitness account of organized, savage attackers operating on the Ayrshire coast. He had a description of their tactics. He had testimony about their numbers. He had a location, however vague. This was enough to take to the king himself. Scotland's King James, whether it was James I in the early 1500s or James VI around 1600, depends on which version of the legend you believe, responded with overwhelming force. This wasn't going to be another fruitless search. This wasn't going to be a small patrol that could be ambushed and destroyed. The king assembled 400 armed men, professional soldiers carrying swords and pikes and firearms. He brought bloodhounds, the best tracking dogs in the kingdom, animals trained to follow scent trails across miles of rough terrain. And either the king himself led the expedition or sent his most trusted commanders, depending on which account you read. Though historians note, the kings rarely risked their lives on dangerous manhunts. Regardless of what the legends claim, the army marched to Ayrshire with local volunteers guiding them, men who knew every cave, every hollow, every hiding place along the coast. They had searched before and found nothing. What made this time different? The Bloodhounds. As the massive search party moved along the coastal cliffs, the dogs suddenly went wild near Bennane Cave, a location that had been dismissed before because the entrance was underwater, flooded by high tide, seemingly too shallow to hide anyone. But the dogs knew better. They smelled death. They smelled rot. They smelled something profoundly wrong. The timing had to be perfect. They waited for low tide, for the seawater to drain from the cave entrance, revealing a passage that went deeper than anyone suspected. As torchlight penetrated the darkness, the soldiers saw that this wasn't a shallow cave. It was a tunnel. It kept going, and the smell, dear God, the smell that rolled out of that darkness was something no one had experienced before. A concentrated reek of death and decay and human waste and something else. Something cooked. With swords drawn and torches held high, 400 men entered Bennane Cave, moving slowly, expecting ambush at any moment, ready to fight for their lives against the cannibals who had terrorized the region for a quarter-century. The passage twisted and turned, going deeper into the earth, branching into side chambers, dripping with moisture that reflected the torchlight like eyes in the darkness. The smell got worse with every step. Then they reached the main chamber, and hardened soldiers, men who had seen battle and death and the worst that humans could do to each other, turned away and vomited. The walls were lined with human remains. Arms and legs hung from crude hooks like meat in a butcher shop, sorted by size, and presumably by freshness. Torsos were stacked in corners, stripped of useful flesh, waiting for disposal. Barros contained pickled organs, preserved in brine, carefully labeled according to some system that only made sense to the monsters who created it. Piles of clothing sat sorted by quality and size, valuables extracted, the rest kept for practical use or fuel. Mountains of bones, gnawed and broken and sucked of marrow, filled entire side chambers like some grotesque ossuary built, not for reverence, but for convenience. The scope was beyond comprehension. This wasn't the work of months, or even years. This was decades of systematic murder and consumption. The Bean family fought, but it was hopeless. 48 cave dwellers, many of them children, some of them elderly, armed with crude weapons, and the desperation of trapped animals, against 400 trained soldiers with steel and firearms and righteousness fueling their rage. The battle was brief and brutal. The family was captured alive, every single one of them, dragged from their chambers and their hiding spots and their darkness into the harsh light of Scottish day. Imagine what they looked like after 25 years underground. Pale skin that had never seen sustained sunlight, eyes that couldn't properly adjust to brightness, bodies nourished entirely on human flesh, showing whatever physical effects such a diet might cause. The children and grandchildren had never known any other life. Some of them had probably never even left the cave, spending their entire existence in absolute darkness, speaking a language that was probably more grunt and gesture than proper words, knowing only family and murder and meat. They were marched to Edinburgh, the entire clan in chains, and the population turned out to see them. These were the monsters who had been stealing loved ones for decades. These were the cannibals who had turned the Ayrshire coast into a feeding ground. These were humans who had voluntarily abandoned humanity and become something else. Something without mercy, or conscience, or any connection to the civilization around them. The trial was unprecedented because there was no trial. The crimes were considered so self-evident, so horrific, so beyond the normal bounds of human behavior that the usual justice system was set aside. The king himself pronounced sentence. The men would die the way their victims had died, slowly and in pieces. The women would watch and then burn. There would be no mercy because they had shown no mercy. There would be no appeal because their guilt was measured in rooms full of human remains. The executions were public and terrible. The 27 men of the Bennane clan, from Sawney himself down to his grandsons, were taken to Edinburgh's execution ground, where a crowd of thousands gathered to witness justice. Their hands and feet were severed, amputated with axes in a grim echo of the dismemberment they had inflicted on so many victims. Then they were left to bleed to death, slowly, watched by the 21 women of the family who were forced to see the end coming for them all. The historical accounts claim that none of them showed remorse. None of them begged for mercy. None of them seemed to understand that what they had done was evil. They had lived so long outside normal human society, had raised so many generations in that darkness, that they apparently couldn't comprehend why they were being punished. To them, they had simply been surviving, feeding their family, taking what they needed from a world that had nothing to offer them. After the men bled out, the women and girls were burned alive in 3 enormous fires, accused not just of cannibalism but of witchcraft. Because how else could you explain a family so thoroughly corrupted, so completely evil? The crowds watched in a mixture of horror and satisfaction. Justice had been done. The monsters were dead. The roads would be safe again. But the question remained. The question that has echoed through centuries and inspired countless did this actually happen? Modern historians are skeptical, pointing out that there are no contemporary records, no official documentation, no court proceedings or execution records that mention Sawney Bean. The earliest written accounts date from the 1700s, more than a century after the event supposedly occurred, published in English chapbooks that were essentially the tabloid press of their era, designed to sell copies by shocking readers with lurid tales. Some scholars argue that the story was anti-Scottish propaganda, created during the Jacobite risings, when England wanted to portray Scots as barbaric savages, barely better than animals. The name Sawney itself was an English slur, a mocking nickname for Scots, the equivalent of calling an Irish character Paddy. The story hits every note of English prejudice against their northern neighbors. They're primitive, they're violent, they practice incest, they live in caves, they can't control their basest urges. It's too perfect, too convenient, too precisely calibrated to confirm English stereotypes. But here's the thing that keeps the legend alive, that prevents it from being dismissed entirely as propaganda. Similar cases have happened in recorded history. Families that isolated themselves and descended into horror. The French tale of the Beast of Govorden, the American Bender family who ran a murder inn. Australia's Snowtown murders involving family members. Isolated clans that turned to violence and brutality exist in documented history, proving that humans are capable of exactly this kind of sustained atrocity when removed from social constraints and oversight. And Scotland itself has darker history that is absolutely confirmed. Birkenhair murdered at least 16 people in Edinburgh to sell their bodies to anatomists. That, up in it. That's documented. Is it really impossible that something worse happened in a more isolated location a century earlier? Maybe Sawney Bean didn't exist exactly as the legends describe. Maybe it was a smaller family, fewer victims, a shorter time frame. Maybe it was a conflation of multiple crimes and disappearances forged into one monstrous narrative. Or maybe, just maybe, something close to this nightmare actually occurred in the darkness beneath the Ayrshire coast, and the full truth was so horrible that it could only be preserved as legend, too terrible to properly document, too shameful to claim as genuine Scottish history. Bennane Cave still exists. You can visit it if you're determined and the tide is right. It's exactly as described in the legends. A sea cave with a flooded entrance, passages that extend deep into the rock, chambers and side tunnels that could easily hide a family or conceal evidence of crimes. Local guides will point it out. Tour companies included in dark tourism routes. The Edinburgh Dungeon has an entire exhibit recreated around the legend. But standing at that cave entrance, watching the sea drain away to reveal the darkness within, you can't help but wonder what really happened here. Did 48 cannibals really live in these passages? Did 1,000 people really die on the roads above? Did King James really lead 400 men into these depths to discover a butcher shop made of human remains? Or is this just a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a propaganda piece designed to sell chapbooks and reinforce prejudice? The truth is, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that the story of Sawney Bean has survived for centuries because it touches something primal in human consciousness. It's the fear of the other, the terror of what humans can become when civilization's thin veneer is stripped away. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fangs and horns. Sometimes it just looks like a family trying to survive, willing to do whatever it takes, crossing lines that should never be crossed until there's no way back to the light. Whether Sawney Bean was real or myth, whether his family truly existed or was invented by English propagandists, the legend serves a purpose. It reminds us that darkness exists, that humans are capable of monstrous things, that the worst horror isn't supernatural. It's what we can do to each other when we choose to abandon our humanity. The cave is still there. The darkness is still deep. And somewhere in the Scottish consciousness, the story of Sawney Bean continues to whisper its terrible warning. Be careful on lonely roads, watch for strangers in wild places, and never ever assume that evil has limits, or boundaries, or mercy, because once humans decide to become monsters, there's no horror. That won't embrace no atrocity, they won't justify no darkness, they won't call home.